Greetings, everybody. This is Alex, and I'm here with Daniel Dumbrill.
Hi, everybody. Nice to see you.
And of course, we have a lot of guests on today's program. I'm sure you guys know most of the names on. We'll just bring them on without further ado to the program. No problem. And I just wanted to say a special thanks to all the audiences that have joined the program today. Our panel, Cyrus Janssen, Patrick Lancaster, and Alex Christoforou. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining today. Really appreciate that. I know everyone's busy, and well, Daniel, it's weird sitting here with you.
It is. It's quite different, isn't it? We're usually in our own little studios, in our own little rooms. So this is going to be a little bit of an interesting challenge, but it's, yeah, definitely good to see everybody here.
Just want to say a special thanks to all the audience as well for tuning in. We're broadcasting on our Facebook channel, which has over 1.3 million subscribers as well. Thank you, Patrick, for including your audience for today's program as well. We greatly appreciate that. And Alex, for inviting your audience in from the Duran and your channel as well. Greatly appreciated. Let's get into it. Here's going to be a couple of topics that we're going to talk about today. Of course, China and the world economy, Ukraine and Russian conflict. We know who and what to direct that to. The Hong Kong-Taiwan situation and the COVID policy. I think we should let's skip the China world economy first, and let's get into the latest news on the Russian conflict. Alex, I saw a video from you this morning. Maybe you want to share that with our audience, what that was all about.
The video, could you guys hear me?
Yeah, the latest one that you did, yeah.
Oh, well, what's going on really right now is Soledar. That's the big news on the ground. The Russian Ministry of Defense, they have come out with an official statement, and they have confirmed that the Russian military has indeed taken Soledar. All attention is now turning to Bakhmut, though there are reports, specifically from the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal, that ran just the other day, which claimed that Ukraine is now looking to retreat from that area as well, and to set up defensive lines further back. So that's according to the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal. And you have more Russian missile strikes. You had in the morning of Saturday, you had some Russian missile strikes in the morning, which targeted Ukraine energy infrastructure. And later on in the day, you had a very big missile strike of about 100 missiles, if I'm not mistaken, which targeted thermal power plants in Ukraine. So that's pretty much a summary as to where we are in the conflict with regards to Ukraine on the ground.
Did you see Zelensky on the Golden Globes?
Yes. Well, it was a video recording of Zelensky for the Golden Globes. Sean Penn introduced him, and it was a really interesting listening to Sean Penn introduce not only Zelensky but all the situation with regards to color revolutions and regime change operations that have taken place in Afghanistan. He mentioned Afghanistan, and he mentioned a couple of other countries. And then he introduced Zelensky. So it was kind of interesting to listen to Sean Penn give his intro as well.
I've got a snippet of it that I will play later for the program, but it was really strange when I was watching the program. Did you see this?
I haven't seen it. I know he does a lot of rounds in a lot of places. He was doing the opening for the New York Stock Exchange once, and it was just absolutely bizarre. But I haven't been following this new stuff.
He has a very active PR, obviously. Zelensky being from the background that he comes from.
I'll pull up this clip here if we can get this on the show here, guys. Okay, here we go.
A human being who tonight represents that spear's most honed tip.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear participants of the 80th Golden Globe Award ceremony, the award was won at a special time. The Second World War wasn't over yet, but the tide was turned. All knew who would win. The war in Ukraine is not over yet, but the tide is turning, and it is already clear who will win.
Global mainstream media are facing a trust crisis. A recent South African poll also revealed that 89% of those who participated do not trust the media.
People down, and they don't just lock them down and say we're going to give you a slap on the wrist. I mean, they are having guns and people with guns going to door to say,
but they may not care about the humanity of this. I mean, to us, thousands of people dying would be something we'd have to stop the nation for. To them, 1 million people, that's just a number.
Well, there we go. I have to tell you, that was really creepy with Sean Penn's going really, I don't know, it's really strange. I mean, this guy has, I mean, you know, I used to watch him with Fast Times at Ridgemont High. That's what I remember him as, Spicoli. But this guy, I mean, he gave away his Grammy. I mean, it's bizarre.
Was it? Yeah. Who was it that gave away? No, it was a Oscar. No, was that Ben Stiller or who that was somebody who went?
That was Sean Penn. That was Sean
Oh,
Penn.
it was Sean
the
Penn.
Oscar.
Yeah, you know, I mean, one of the ways that I got started at YouTubing and vlogging and things like that was talking about the Hong Kong situation. And I knew quite a lot about the Hong Kong situation. I lived there. I had a lot of friends there. So I'm really careful to not form opinions on, you know, too strong of opinions on this whole conflict that's going on with Russia and Ukraine. But the thing that's really bizarre to me is just seeing the attention that this is getting and just the hypocrisy around the whole thing. I mean, if you had, you know, some sort of spokespeople that were going out on these media circuits successfully speaking to the public about resisting American occupation and any of the American invasions, I mean, it would be, you know, it would be the same kind of a thing to have that same level of interest. And it's just, I mean, I can get into later on. I want to talk a little bit about what my fascination is with the conflict in terms of the hypocrisy and the double standards. But maybe you want to continue on with the topic a little bit more first.
Yeah, I mean, sure. And also just inviting the audience to actually subscribe to all these channels that we've listed below in the description. Great to see you there, Cyrus. Nice to have you here today. Boy,
yeah, it's good to be here.
We're making a bet. Is that a green screen or is that your actually house behind you?
Yeah, I'm on a green screen right now. This is not my house.
Got to be one of the best.
Yeah, thank you guys. Yeah, I'm away from my studio right now, but it's good to be here with everybody. Obviously, good to see Patrick again. We did an interview about a year ago, I think. You know, it was really good to get your info on the ground, and I'm just very honored to join this panel. Again, I'm going to let Alex and Patrick. You guys are the main guys that know about Russia, Ukraine. But it is interesting. I mean, I think I'm the only one that's living in America right now. I will mention. I mean, actually, Caitlin Johnstone, who's a great follow on Twitter, she put out a thread yesterday that just documented all of Zelensky's media appearances. It's incredible. I mean, and there's an interesting thing here in America where Noam Chomsky had said, we do not have this free press right now because there is a very large effort of the American media to be blocking anything that, from the Russian side. And I'm very much one that I'm not a huge fan of the conflict. I don't really know a lot about it, to be honest. That's why I don't focus my blogs on that specifically. That's why I invited Patrick. I said, hey, why don't you share with my audience what's going on in the ground? But it is a very interesting thing of just how he's being portrayed here in America. But I think a lot of people are really starting to get very fatigued with how many billions of dollars of our tax dollars are being sent there. And also just, I mean, you're in a war, but yet you're on the cover of Vogue, you're doing Grammys, Golden Globes. I mean, you're just being paraded about all this American media. It's a very interesting thing that I think a lot of Americans are starting to kind of turn their heads a little bit about.
Yeah, I think if I want to, I know that I'm kind of in the same category as you. I'd like people who know a little bit more about the situation to talk about it, but I think it's still interesting from the point of view of us looking at this from the outside, because if I remember correctly, I think you were kind of struggling with the idea of this too, because anti-war is anti-war and you're against all wars. You don't want any conflicts to happen, obviously, but there's a lot of people who empathize a bit with Russia's position. And I think, was that something you were struggling with before too, Cyrus, to say, well, all these people around me, some of my friends and things like that are empathizing with Russia, and this isn't something I'm very comfortable with. Is that something that you went through also?
Definitely. And I think the interesting thing is I try to educate myself from both sides. And, I'd listen to like John Mearsheimer, who's been a very outspoken professor at the University of Chicago, who, I think 3 or 4 years ago, very much predicted exactly what was going to happen. I mean, in that YouTube video that he's done, I think he's done over 20 million views now, because he gave a keynote speech at a university saying, Ukraine is going to get wrecked. This is what's going to happen. And it's the United States that is pushing Russia to do this. So I think there's some when you really talk to people that understand this conflict, there is a lot more behind the story. But it's also interesting because we see all of these Ukraine flags everywhere, and a lot of people, they don't understand really what's going on. So again, I'm just one where I want to stay curious, and that's why I really value people like Alex and Patrick to help me better understand the situation. But yeah, I mean, it's a very conflicting one. I'm not a fan of war at any cost. So I'm just hoping for, as we're talking about huge geopolitical events in 2023, I'm hoping for a conclusion to this and hopefully a return back to normal, whatever that means. I'd like to see this conflict end this year.
Yeah, for sure. I think, looking at what Patrick Lancaster brings to the table, showing this kind of the other side of the story, also the Duran channel has been really valuable. Also, what I've been, the reason I asked you is because I've always been interested in listening to people who I always saw as saying they were anti-war, anti-imperialist, suddenly empathizing with Russia. And when you look at it, the John Mearsheimer, it's not only him, it's even Biden himself who said many years ago, if we do this is what's going to provoke a reaction from Russia. It looked like there were some pretty simple steps to mitigate this risk. I got in a Twitter debate with McFaul. He was the previous U.S. ambassador to Russia.
Yes.
What's his first name? Michael McFaul?
I think it's Michael McFaul.
Yeah, Michael McFaul. Because he posted, he said Russia had nothing to be afraid of with NATO. NATO would have never attacked Russia unless Russia attacked one of NATO's allies. And so I replied to him. I said, well, which ally did Libya attack? Because obviously there was a NATO bombing campaign of Libya that basically bombed them back into the Stone Age, one of the richest countries in Africa,
right?
Just destroyed them. And he replied with, well, he was going to commit genocide in Benghazi, so we had to do something. So it was punishing him for crimes he had not yet committed. And so I said, so that means that the prerequisite is not that they have to attack a NATO country. It's that you have to come up with a good enough story in order to go in and attack or bomb them. And also Max Blumenthal at the same time chimed in and said, well, actually, there was an independent EU panel that said that was completely, there was no evidence to support that. And after he posted that, McFaul deleted his original reply because it looked a little bit silly after that. But it gives you a kind of a context that Russia was in a situation where they saw, even NATO admitted that they were in Ukraine since 2014 training forces. What do? Do they wait until they get to their border, this organization that has already proven itself to be an aggressive organization, and wait until the point it's absolutely too late? So from an anti-imperialist, anti-war perspective, I think a lot of people are looking at it from the point of view saying that this would be an expansion of American empire. It would be the end of any chance of any multipolarity of multiple players in the market. And I think obviously Cyrus, you also know a little bit more about China, and we're seeing that in action with China going into these countries and waiving loans and doing all these kinds of infrastructure projects that all of a sudden have the West competing with them.
Correct.
They have all of a sudden the West competing with them. I mean, everybody at the end of the day is looking out for their own interests. I remember there's a book, what is it called? The Economic Hitman.
Yes.
Yeah, right. And so the author, when he was in an interview on Valuetainment, he was talking about he has very close relationships with Latin American leaders. And they said, we know China's after our resources also. But the difference is when we deal with them, they're not going to come in and assassinate our leaders. So at least there's some other options there. So from somebody who doesn't know much about the conflict, I think it's just a valuable perspective in terms of somebody sitting on the sidelines and understanding why people are empathizing with the Russian side, not necessarily agreeing with them or supporting them, but empathizing with the position. But that's maybe going a little bit too much. Maybe we should hear from people who actually analyze the conflict a little bit more in detail.
I mean, my concern is, not only this war, but these countries that are, getting in so much debt. Okay, let's look at how much America has spent. 100 million. Like, Cyrus, this does affect you, even though it doesn't. You know what I mean? Like, this is directly hitting the American taxpayer. $100 billion.
Yeah, 100%. I think a lot of people are, like I mentioned, I think there is a big sentiment in America right now of questioning where these funds are going, and we see a lot of struggles here inside of this country. And a lot of people are, wanting a resolution to this. And I think, but again, it's what we see very common. I mean, most Americans just have zero clue about geopolitics, world events. I mean, they just really don't understand, and unless you're actively seeking out that information, you're not going to be in the know. I'm curious to hear from Patrick. You know, Patrick, you and I sat down, I don't know, about 10, 11 months ago, you know, really discussing, you know, this conflict. And it's good to see you on screen again. I'd like to get your perspective, you know, and kind of share with the audience, you know, some updates on what you've been doing and kind of from your viewpoint, since you're literally on the ground.
Well, I think the most important thing, obviously, right now is what's going to happen right now. Things are definitely changing because of the weather. That's the most important thing on the ground, is the fact that the ground has frozen now and things are getting a lot harsh, more harsh for the soldiers themselves on the front line, but also getting easier for a lot of the equipment to operate and a lot of the equipment to come from mainland Russia into Donbass. For several months, they've been very bogged down with the mud and just the swamp-like atmosphere along the front lines. But now things are changing, so the soldiers are expecting, and they've been expecting for the last month, a big push from the Russian side into Ukrainian-controlled territory. Now, as Alex mentioned, we were seeing that the tide changing in Soledar and Artyomsk or Bakhmut. And soon it seems Russian forces, and particularly Wagner, are going to be taking more control for the Russian side there. And there's really a lot of questions what's going to happen. I mean, it's such a boiling pot right now, between all the way south to Kherson and up to the Kharkov region. Even for me, it's hard to decide which area I'm going to be going to, because there's just so many possibilities of things to develop very, very soon, and having a lot of things turning. Because, I mean, it's true, we all see this. 10 months ago, everyone expected Russia to be done in a week or 3 days, as they said. But obviously it's not happening, and there's been a lot of losses. And now people are thinking that something's got to give, and Russia's really got to make some serious gains to show that they still have it. Now, as far as Zelensky is saying, it's clear who the winner is going to be in this war. I think it's always been clear, and it's of course it's clear that the winner in this situation, whatever that win is going to be, that's the one thing that's not clear, is where is the line that Russia is going to draw to say, for them to say, okay, we've won and we've achieved what we wanted to. Now, at first, many people thought that line was going to be going all the way across the Black Sea and controlling the whole coast all the way to Transnistria in Moldova. Now, is that going to be Putin's line now? A lot of things have happened, so maybe not. But Russia's going to mark a line for their achievement and their win, as they'll call it, and whatever that is, it's going to be not great for Ukraine, or what was previously looked at as Ukraine. But the fact of Zelensky saying Ukraine is going to be the clear winner, I mean, with, of course, the exception of NATO fully moving into Ukraine with troops on the ground, I think anyone who with a slight bit of intelligence knows that who's going to come out on top. It just depends on what that top is going to be in this. So, as I said, right now I'm just trying to decide exactly which area I'm going to be headed to, because obviously there's a lot going on in Bakhmut and Artyomsk and Soledar. But I'm also thinking about possibly heading up to the Eleanor-Kharkov border to see what the situation is there. But then at any time, the situation can develop into exchanging of territory on the Kherson direction as well. So it's just a matter of time what develops and what is the outcome. But we can definitely say that before this is over, there's no question that everything that Russia recognizes as part of Russia will be under control of Russia. There's no question about that. It just depends on how much farther than that. So Donetsk and Lugansk will be totally under control of Russia, as well as Zaporozhye and Kherson. There's no doubt about that. But when that's going to happen is the question, and how it's going to happen.
You know, I want to pass this over to Alex. I've seen an incredible amount of footage and reporting coming out of this region. So thank you for that, Patrick. And I've always said that some of the stuff that you're videoing and going out and risking your life for is eventually going to show up in a tribunal. One day, eventually, it will show up in a tribunal. The one thing I wanted to ask you, Alex, I mean, you run a pretty large channel called the Duran with your friend, Alex, as well. I mean, you are the go-to channel pretty much in the world here for information coming out of Russia. I mean, that must come with a fair amount of pressure. And I mean, what kind of made you really focus on Russia?
What made us focus on Russia? To be honest, when we started reporting on what's going on in the world, we just set out a goal to be a geopolitical news channel. And much of our reporting early on was actually on Trump and Russiagate and Ukrainegate and all of that stuff that was going on. But even back then, you could see the hatred for Russia being stirred in much the same way that you see a lot of the hatred for China that takes place now as well. You could see all of this this animosity and this targeting of Russia being stirred in the United States way back in 2015, 16. And a lot of that had to do with the elections. Most of it had to do with the elections. It had to do with Hillary Clinton and Russiagate and Trump's Putin stooge and all of these things. But if you go back to that time period, you could see that in much the same way that Cyrus was talking about Mearsheimer, you could see that the United States was moving towards some sort of bad outcome with Russia. Relations between Russia and the United States were in a very bad state in 2016, 2017. And one of the reasons I believe that they went after Trump so hard is because Trump actually, early on in his campaign, he actually said he would like to make relations better between the U.S. and Russia. And that was just, I mean, people just flipped out when they heard that. You know, the neoliberal elite, they just couldn't stomach the thought of some sort of dialogue or relations between Russia and the United States. So, I mean, we focused on Russia because it kind of was the natural progression of where things were going, and we ended up in what eventually was this conflict, this war, this special military operation, and we've been, you know, reporting on it from the context of going back to 2015, 2016, because I don't think you can really understand this conflict between Russia, Ukraine, and Russia and, you know, what people call the collective West, what I like to refer to as the collective West / NATO, until you go back to the Maidan and then you go back to the 2016 election. And I think that's how a lot of people in the rest of the world, 80% of the world, also see what's going on between Russia and the United States and NATO. They don't just take it from the context of this war started on February 24th, 2022, which is what Zelensky and the collective West media would like the narrative to be. I think a lot of people realize that this goes back to 2014 and the Maidan coup, maybe even further back to the first regime change operation in Ukraine that dated in 2003, if I'm not mistaken. But, you know, this has been an evolution. This conflict has been an evolution. And for 8 years, from the Maidan up to the 24th of February, Putin gave constant and consistent warnings that Russia's security has to be addressed in the context of Europe and vis-a-vis NATO. Weekly warnings. And to be quite honest, the only thing that Ukraine had to do, and the powers that had controlled Ukraine since the coup. We can't forget that Ukraine was being controlled by a coup government from 2014 onwards. The government of Yanukovych was a democratically elected government. No one disputes that, not even the United States. And that government was overthrown by the Obama White House and by the European Union. But Putin was consistent in saying the one thing that we need to have happen, and the one thing that the West could have done, is for Ukraine to just say that they're going to be neutral.
Right.
They had the Minsk agreements, which now we know, according to Angela Merkel, Francois Hollande, as well as Petro Poroshenko, 3 parties that were involved in the Minsk agreement, they all have come out and said that they had no intention to follow or enforce the Minsk agreement. Okay, so we know that now, but all Ukraine had to do was say, we are not going to get into NATO. We have no interest to go into NATO. And then this conflict would have been averted. But that was not the case. We actually saw a ramping up of the rhetoric for Ukraine to enter into NATO. And eventually, I think that the Russian government, they said, okay, we're going to try to force the issue. And that's when they launched a special military operation. And up until the end of March, in my opinion, looking at everything that the Russian military did, they weren't looking to escalate the conflict. They were looking to force Zelensky's hand to enforce the Minsk agreements and to put it into the Ukrainian constitution via some sort of framework or some sort of agreement, international agreement, that Ukraine would become neutral. And that's when you had Boris Johnson flying to Ukraine at the end of March, early April. And that's where, in my opinion, this conflict moved from a conflict between Russia and Ukraine to a conflict between Russia and NATO. So it's kind of a long answer as to how we got into this, but to summarize what I said, this was a natural progression from the 2016 elections up to today. I mean, this was baked in the cake for the collective West. And going back to what Cyrus said about Chomsky and Caitlin Johnston, they had an interesting article on Consortium News where I believe Caitlin Johnston, she quoted Chomsky as saying that the collective West continues to frame this war as an unprovoked conflict. But all the other wars that the United States, that they engaged in, the media never labeled those conflicts unprovoked. And so you can see how they continue to want to poke at the bear. This is something that's not going to end until Russia finally puts its marker down and says, this is where we have to stop this. And to bring this to China, maybe a segue to China, the plan all along, the way I view this is, the plan was Russia first, China next.
Absolutely.
And I think a lot has changed now because Russia weathered those economic shock and awe sanctions. That's where they thought they were going to get the regime change, and that's where they thought they were going to be able to knock out Russia and then to hone in on China over the next decade. So I think a lot has changed now. But they have no reverse gear. That's my final point. Right. They have no reverse gear, so they're going to continue to move on with this plan.
What you said towards the end about China also kind of reminds me of also McFall. He also tweeted something out recently. He said it's a weird comparison he made with Germany, but he said, P.S. like Germany after 1945, a complete defeat of Russian imperialism in 2023 would begin to create the permissive conditions for Russia to finally become a normal European country after the Putin era ends. And so I had retweeted that and made a very similar point to you that by normal, he, of course, means a place with U.S. military bases that will say, thanks, we know you did it for our own good when its cross-border pipelines are blown up, who will help out with efforts to hold China down and who will be more receptive to preserving American hegemony. Because at the end of the day, that's what it's about. And that's what's at risk also. If Russia were to fall, there'd be implications for the world, and the kinds of neocolonialism and U.S. imperialism that's going on would just have free reign. There's a chance for it to be challenged now. And I think that goes back to my point also, why you see some people who are anti-imperialist, anti-war saying, well, hold on a second here. There's a lot at stake here. The hypocrisy with the wars also. You know, a lot of people say, okay, the Iraq war was a mistake because we thought they had weapons of mass destruction. But the point is actually they almost legitimize the idea that even if they did, if they actually did have weapons of mass destruction, if they were right and they had these kinds of terrible weapons above and beyond the ones that they, of course, already bought from the US, or they were producing them, that maybe they would have been justified in doing that. That would have been a security risk, even though this country is all the way on the other side of the world. Now we're talking about a country that's right on the border with Russia that could potentially become a serious threat to Russia. But what I'm more curious about with your coverage and with your reporting is because at least what I found when I was covering Hong Kong, there were a lot of really clearly obvious facts and obvious things that were being ignored in the context of the riots, how civilians were being targeted. The media refused to cover the guy who was lit on fire by the protesters, all this kind of stuff. And also the context also beforehand. What kinds of things were put in place? What did the extradition bill actually say? It was all lied about in the media. But I found that it got to a point that eventually it just became too obvious that we started to see more of a flow of people changing their mind and saying, oh, hold on a second. Now, it's fascinating to me to see with Ukraine, people absolutely denying that there's any sort of a Nazi issue in Ukraine, that there's any sort of a Nazi battalion. You even got NATO that, I don't know if you guys saw when they tweeted out that Happy Women's Day photo with Ukrainian female soldiers. And then when they realized that she had a Nazi patch on her arm, they had to delete the photo. Of course, the internet never forgets, and there's screenshots of that now. But to get to my question, Alex, when you're doing this reporting and you're seeing these people that are just resisting basic facts or the context or the history, are you seeing any sort of a shift, or and is it improving where you do see people coming over to the other side and saying, okay, well, hold on a second here. Maybe there is a context. Maybe I am looking at this a little bit too black and white.
Yes, absolutely. Because now, for a lot of people that are living in Europe or the United States, Canada, etc., they're actually seeing this affect their pocketbooks. I mean, this is hurting their way of living now, because all the money that is being spent in Ukraine, the sanctions, specifically the sanctions, have been a terrible misstep. They've boomeranged back, and they've hurt Europe, and they've hurt the United States. They've hurt the UK. So now a lot of people are saying, "Wait a minute." I thought, we were going to knock out Putin. We were going to get into Russia. We were going to get all the resources, all the oil, and everything would go back to normal. But that's not the case. Everyone thought that Russia was this country masquerading, this gas station masquerading as a country. That famous phrase that people say, the GDP of Russia is the size of the state of Delaware or stuff like that. And that's not the case. And so a lot of people are now starting to look into things and say, this wasn't as easy as they were telling us it was going to be, and Russia is not as weak as they were telling us it was. And now we're seeing 9, and we're about to go on 10 sanctions packages from the EU, which one after another is hurting the European Union more than it's hurting Russia. Russia has pretty much put the sanctions in the rearview mirror at this point. I mean, they're moving past the sanctions, but the European Union is hurting more and more. The more that time goes on, the more the European Union is going to suffer from the effects of these sanctions. And so the more it hurts the everyday citizen, the more I believe that everyday citizen is going to be like, wait a minute, maybe I need to look at this a little bit differently. There was just a poll the other day out of Hungary, and the Hungarian government put out a questionnaire, and they posted those results about the sentiment of the people with regards to sanctions against Russia. And 97% of Hungarians actually said that the sanctions are a complete and utter failure, and this needs to stop.
That's an interesting point. Patrick, this is for you. I'm not sure. Have you ever read the Minsk Agreement?
I haven't, no.
Okay, well, here's number 8. Okay, and this will tell you that this whole agreement had really it wasn't going anywhere. But here it says, definition of full resumption of social economic ties, okay, including social transfers such as pensions, payments, and other payments, incomes, and revenue, timely payments of all utility bills in reinstating taxation. So here's a country, right? Here's a country that has basically said, all right, in 2014, 2015, we're going to shut your water off. We're going to shut your electricity off. We're going to shut your banking system off and use our military against our own civilians. And that's right in that agreement right there, that they cut everybody off, blew up the airport while they were at it. And when I'm seeing that type of stuff in print, it says to me, this was never in good faith. This was a straight line, as you were saying, Alex, that it's Russia first. And I think this is going to be a game plan for China. That's my honest feeling.
A game plan for China? What do you mean in that way?
I think, you know, the NGOs, we know how honest and great most of them are. You've seen what happened in Hong Kong.
Right.
You know, and Patrick, you and I have talked about this before, right? Because Patrick and I don't see eye to eye on this one, but I honestly feel that they're going to try to find something with Taiwan here and to try to really make it, you know, aggressive. The media is trying to do it as aggressive as possible. Airplanes, you know, flying over, China is poking them, you know. Are we about to witness another Ukraine situation?
Yeah, I mean, that is the risk, isn't it? I mean, that's when you saw with Nancy Pelosi's visit and the rhetoric around that, it did look like they were trying to provoke something. And it was kind of, everybody was expecting that there was going to be a big reaction to that. And finally there wasn't. I mean, I really liked what was happening before these provocations were happening. Relations between Taiwan and the mainland were continually improving. Flights between the two sides were increasing. Business was increasing. People were doing cross-strait business. And then suddenly just things started going downhill. Actually, around the Hong Kong protests also, it was used as a catalyst also. A lot of media was put into Taiwan about what was going on, all of the same disinformation. But that is a fear about continuing this. I mean, I think that's one of the problems with having the military-industrial complex involved so closely with the government. I mean, what is it? What were the statistics from a few years ago? It costs an average of $12 million to become a senator. And these are corporate sponsorships that come in to help them run their campaigns and things like that. This isn't charity. They want a return on that investment. And it was Eisenhower who said in his farewell speech that one of the biggest threats to American democracy was the military-industrial complex. And when you see the CEO of Raytheon going on and saying to his investors in their earnings calls, saying, we see some increased tensions in the Asia-Pacific region, and this could create a really big profit potential for us. And then these same military-industrial complex companies are funding think tanks like ASPI in Australia, Australian Strategic Policy Institute, to post China threat stories. So they're funded to post China threat stories. And finally, if they do provoke a reaction or they do provoke something, the sponsors of these narratives are going to win. I mean, it's all designed where we're in a really risky situation here where potentially something definitely could happen.
Yeah, I mean, the media machine is huge. I mean, Cyrus, in the United States, all you're hearing is potential war in Taiwan. What are you hearing down there?
Yeah, thanks, guys. You know, it's an interesting situation because I wanted to kind of go back first to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And you know, I've got a lot of friends on the ground in China. And as you guys know, I mean, most Chinese actually are very pro-Russian, you know, from that perspective, because they feel if, you know, Russia first, then China's next. And I think what we're seeing here is, I mean, you know, this is what I spend my channel on, is trying to be a bit more of a balanced American media source, you know, trying to fill in this gap. And there's just so much of this fear from China, you know, that is said every day in our media here. And absolutely, I think one of the interesting things that you see with Nancy Pelosi going to Taiwan, some of the best analysts that said this, and I'm talking even, you know, I've actually been listening to some think tanks from the U.S. trying to, you know, some China-based some U.S. think tanks that really focus on China, based in Washington, D.C., obviously have a very strong U.S. government, you know, stance. But even some of the experts in there had said, you know, there was no purpose for Nancy Pelosi to go to Taiwan. You know, essentially, she knew that her term was coming up as the Speaker of the House. She basically wanted to stick it to China, is what one of the analysts had said. And there was a very interesting point when I read that, because she knew what she was doing. She had one last shot to kind of take a shot at China. She did it, but there was really no benefit from her going there. And actually, there's a big story that many people aren't talking about, and that's that, you know, the Taiwanese president, Tsai Ing-wen, you know, she lost her election. And this is something that has not been mentioned one time in Western media, most specifically American media. And the issue was that I found very interesting is that, you know, you kind of see this rhetoric here in America where we're saying like, you know, Taiwanese people are living in fear every day, you know, that, you know, they absolutely want independence, you know, they absolutely need a strong relationship with America. And the reason that Tsai Ing-wen lost that election in Taiwan is because people said, you're not focusing on the real issues inside of Taiwan, right? Like you're, you know, you're so focused on getting closer to America. You're so focused on, for example, bringing Pelosi over here. But what about our local issues here? And, you know, I think it was maybe a year ago or 18 months ago, The Economist came out and said, you know, Taiwan, the most dangerous place in the world. And I'm thinking, really? Like Taiwan? Like out of all the places in the world, you're going to put Taiwan as the most dangerous? Like, give me a break. And then I, you know, would watch some other media stories where, you know, they, you know, and these would be in Chinese, and they'd go and interview, you know, like a noodle shop owner. And it's like, are you living every day in fear that China's going to bomb you? And it's like, yeah, I've been kind of hearing this for like 40 years. Like, no, I'm just going to be selling my noodles. You know, we're living happy here in Taiwan. Taiwan's a great place. Love it here. Yeah, you know, it's just kind of what it is what it is. And so there's this huge disconnect that we see. And again, I think that Tsai Ing-wen lost that election because she, you know, brought over Pelosi. And, you know, again, people were protesting outside of her hotel. I think she's in the Grand Hyatt right in Taipei. People are protesting outside of that hotel. Like, we don't want you here. Get out of here. Stop provoking things. We do not want you here. That would never be shown on American media, right? You will never see that there was protests against there. I mean, they paid Mike Pompeo, I think, you know, that was disclosed. I think they paid him $350,000 US to come over, give about a 25-minute speech. And, you know, and again, so this is what Tsai Ing-wen is doing. All right, let's get Pelosi over. Let's get Pompeo over. Let's kind of preach this thing. Meanwhile, it's like, what do you do? Like, you know, Taiwanese people are like, well, what about our local issues here? We got a lot of local issues we need to focus on. You're not doing that. And guess what? It cost her the election. And then again, that's something you don't hear at all in Western media, most specifically American media.
Yeah, I think for a lot of people who already got to the point, because it's interesting when Alex was saying that people empathize with the situation and they've looked at it a little bit differently because it's affecting their pocketbook. So there was this early catalyst that allowed people to say, well, let me take a step back. If I'm paying this much money into this, let me take a step back and take a look at this. You don't have the same situation in China and Taiwan. You don't have, it's not really affecting anybody in the West, the discourse over this. But it would be, when you really think about it, for somebody to empathize with Russia about the security risk that was posed with bordering Ukraine, with Ukraine and what was going on with NATO, it should be fairly easy for people to empathize with the security risks of a conflict being provoked via Taiwan, the same place where the Japanese had launched all their attacks from on China. It's of incredible strategic importance when you are targeted by a country like the US. And I think people should be looking out for all the same warning signs about saying, well, are they trying to do the same things in Taiwan that they were doing in Ukraine? And from what we can see and what you've explained also, it does look like the same kind of things are going on.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would have to say that, you know, adding what Daniel was talking about with, you know, the NATO involvement. I mean, I remember talking to you about the story about the Yugoslavia and what was going on there. I mean, that was 78 days of an aerial bombardment. They absolutely destroyed that country. It has never been, you know, relived its glory days. And I think that's why you're seeing the pushback. Just to focus with Alex here for a moment, I notice in a lot of your reporting that Serbia comes up a lot. And I think that they've seen this too many times. And I think that with Serbia, I think they're going to be a holdout when it comes to more the pressure from the European Union. I mean, Alex, you've done a lot of you know, talking about Serbia and some of your conversations. I mean, what do you think why are they the ones that are standing out the most of the countries in Europe?
Oh, well, I mean, the the friendship between Russia and Serbia is, I mean, it's unbreakable at this point. And any Serbian president who would dare to impose sanctions on Russia, he wouldn't last long. He or she would not last long in office, because the sentiment of the Serbs at this point in time is full support for Russia, and Serbia is in a very tough situation, because they're a country located smack in the middle of Europe in the Balkans, and they're surrounded by the European Union and NATO. And that's what we've seen over the past 15 years. We've seen NATO slowly just swallow up all of these little microstates all around Serbia and put them into the alliance. And they've surrounded Serbia, and Serbia's been that holdout. And you go back to the Michael McFaul tweet that you were talking about, and what about what NATO did to Yugoslavia and to Serbia? I mean, there's a lot of commonalities between Russia and Serbia. Serbia, Yugoslavia, Serbia, the Slavic culture, the Orthodox religion. These are things that Serbia would never be able to, in my opinion, to align with the European Union or with the collective West and go against Russia. And this is really bothering the EU and NATO. As are other countries, as is the fact that India has not gone along with the sanctions against Russia. Turkey is a NATO country that is playing it neutral. I mean, there are a lot of big, important countries that are seeing this conflict in a very different light.
Yeah, I think that's where the importance of channels like yours come through, because you're not seeing that come through in the Western media. I mean, a lot of this stuff just doesn't get reported. I think that's probably one of the reasons why RT was banned also. They had their YouTube channels and everything like that geo-blocked. And I've always said, if China had the ability to tell their story, their side of the story, as well as Russia does, because Russia puts out some pretty good programs, and they really are pretty good at breaking down the situation. Going Underground is one of my favorite shows on RT. They run it out of London, and they talk to all of the people that Western media would never speak to. Like, for example, Gaddafi's spokesperson after, their country was destroyed, hearing his side of the story. But I mean, that's where, do you ever feel there's a risk? I mean, do you set up, do you guys, I know I talked to Patrick about this before, but do you set up backups, and do you always have it in the back of your mind that any moment you could be censored because you're telling the side of the story that is deliberately being suppressed in the media?
Everyone can get censored for all kinds of stories nowadays. I mean, not even political stories. So I think, you try to be on as many platforms as you can, and you back up whatever you can. And I mean, at the end of the day, you have to report what you feel is the truth. But I mean, this, the censorship, it goes past politics. I mean, you get called, as I'm sure everyone on this panel does every now and then, you can get called a Putin troll, a Russian shill, a Chinese troll, a communist, all of these things. You hear these things nonstop. But it doesn't change the reality of the situation. I mean, they can call you all the names that they want to call you, but it doesn't change the fact that the situation is as it is. And we've got a conflict right now in Ukraine. Tensions are high in China, and we need to engage in some sort of discourse and try to explain things from the other side, or from a side that isn't so partisan to the narrative coming out from the collective West. So, I mean, can you get censored? Sure, but look at everything that Elon Musk is releasing. All of the stories that we thought that they were telling us were true, like the Russian bot story on Twitter, we're now finding out was all a bunch of lies. There were no Russian bots. Lies.
Right, but there was a huge State Department initiative to curate stories and censor people on Twitter.
Sure, and they were pressuring Twitter, So, and then that was coming from senators, from congressmen, from Adam Schiff, from all of these people that were pressuring Twitter to say, no, you're going to make a statement and say that there are Russian bots that are pushing these hashtags. And Twitter's like, there are no Russian bots.
Right.
We're seeing our data. There's no such thing, but they had to push the narrative. And this is where I get worried, because what you see in China the sentiment in the West with regards to China, however you may see their government and what they're doing, the demonization of a country eventually over years and over decades can lead to conflict, and eventually does. And everything that you saw with Russia, you are seeing with China. People forget that Zelensky, when he ran for president, he ran on a platform of enforcing the Minsk agreements. And that's why the Ukrainians voted for him. The minute he got into office, everything changed. Everything changed.
You know,
so even at a time where you could see Taiwan and China, they may have had relations may have been getting better for a time period. And then Nancy Pelosi makes her trip, and all of a sudden, everything goes in a completely different direction. So this is why we have to be very vigilant and very careful.
Agreed.
Right. Yeah. I think, I mean, when you talked about censoring also, getting back to that topic, you can definitely be censored for almost anything these days, but there's certain things that put you at a greater risk than with other things. And I think, you know, with trying to curate the story on Russia, that was one of them. And I was just, I got tagged in a tweet that was just put out. I'm not sure if she's part of the Ukrainian government, Melania Podolyak. Do you know this? So military, humanitarian, and humanitarian is going to be important to remember. So I want to read this tweet to you. And if this was directed at anybody else, this person would be censored right away. They would have lost their account. So what she said, because it looks like, and maybe you can talk about this after one of you who focus on this a little bit more, either Patrick or Alex, but there was a situation where there was a residential building that looks like it was hit. The Russian missile attack is being blamed for that. And what she tweeted out was, "It is absolutely fair for me to wish all Russians and Russia be wiped off the face of the earth. It's not hate speech. It's not horrible of me. It's just fair." Now, I mean, that... If you can imagine, for example, if somebody was upset with a missile strike from Israel against Palestine, and somebody said something like this against them, that would be an immediate suspension. They would be absolutely, completely demonized. They would be taken off of. So every platform they would have been taken off of. So there are certain things that are obviously putting yourself at more risk if you're on the wrong side of the narrative. But with this in particular, I don't know if you guys have heard anything about this residential building, or if it's too early to know too many details about this.
Yeah, Patrick?
Yeah, I've heard bits about that. Now, this is kind of the normal thing when civilians are hit on the Ukrainian side. Ukraine says it was the result of a direct Russian attack on a civilian area, and Russia says it was the result of Ukrainian anti-aircraft rockets hitting Russian cruise missiles above the city and redirecting them, and the anti-aircraft weapons hitting the residential buildings. Now, we're not sitting on top of the rockets. I'm not in that area. I tend to try to stick to what I see with my own eyes, but that's the two sides. Ukraine says it's a direct attack on residents, which doesn't really make sense if you're looking at it from the Russian side. And Russian says that it is a result of anti-aircraft rockets coming back down and hitting residential areas, like we saw in the beginning weeks of the war, when there was a rocket that made a direct hit on a residential high-rise building in Kiev, where it was clear that the motor of the rocket was still running. And now Ukraine said that that was a Russian rocket. Now, these Russian rockets, when they're coming down, the motor would not still be hot, and flames would not be coming out of the back of the motor. The flames would be coming out of the back of the motor if it was an anti-aircraft rocket that was coming back down. Now, so in that instance, when there's actual video evidence, we could say that it was a Ukrainian anti-aircraft rocket or anti-missile rocket. Now, on this attack today, we can't tell, but we just have the two different sides of the story.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, it's war. At the end of the day, there are going to be casualties. There are going to be things like this that happen. and nobody wants to see this, and that's more the reason to hope that there's a quick end to this. But that goes back to at the beginning of the show when I was talking about the hypocrisy. What's really interesting when you hear the things that people think should happen to Russia and should happen to Putin as a result of this, to be, whatever it is, even if they want to believe all of the stories and they don't want the context like that you just gave, and they say that, well, these are things that are deserving to go in front of a tribunal. These are things that he needs to be persecuted as a war criminal. And I think Caitlin Johnston made this point too. It's like, well, you can't selectively do that. If this is what we want to do, then fine, okay, all right. But there's a backlog of people that we've got to deal with. From Tony Blair to Bush to Obama, to all of these people who committed these kinds of war crimes or launched wars on false pretenses. Otherwise, you don't really care about this. You're just weaponizing it and you're just targeting people with it. Show that you care about it and lead by example. Okay, let's see what you do with your war criminals first. That's kind of the way I look at it. So the whole thing for me, focusing on this, and it's interesting, like even if you don't take a strict side in this conflict, people want to force you into a box, and they can't take a moment to think about it and say, well, hold on a second, you're right. If this is what I think should be done to people who do these kinds of things, then why aren't we pushing for this kind of stuff with our previous leaders? But it creates a whole dynamic where there is this one-way accountability, and I'll give you some context also. With some people who vlog about China or talk about China, a lot of the times they are reluctant to talk about the negatives. There are negatives. It's nothing like what the media says. But the reason they're reluctant to is because that's the piece that needs filling in. That's the piece that's not being told. But also, if there are issues, you could take the smallest issue in a country that's being targeted by the US, and when that's published, it can sometimes lead to real consequences. It actually leads to real sanctions or real, actions against that country. And it's like kind of with, Human Rights Watch, for example, that organization, they appear on the surface to be balanced. They will outright call George Bush a war criminal. But what happens with that? Nothing's going to happen with that. Everybody knows George Bush is going to walk free for the rest of his life, and he's never going to be tried for any of the crimes he committed or any of the wars that he launched under false pretenses. But when Human Rights Watch comes out with a report saying, oh, this is what's going on in China, those reports are actually used for sanctions and actually used to take down a country. And in a lot of cases based on imagining that China might be doing the things that the US actually does around the world. So that kind of goes into the hypocrisy that I was talking about, expanding on a little bit earlier on. But,
right. Yeah. I think one of my concerns is when you're talking about people being reluctant to either write things or say things about China. I mean, let's look at this panel here today. I mean, pretty much everyone on this panel has either had a hit piece written about them, be deplatformed, demonetized. I mean, Patrick Lancaster was the first guy I ever met that lost his monetization on YouTube. I mean, that is unbelievable. Now, if we didn't have the Patrick Lancasters or the Durans or the Daniel Dumbrills or the Cyrus Janssens, who would we have? And I'm not saying that in an arrogant way, but I'm saying that in a way that there's a concern here. And my concern is we are putting our necks on the line to try to get the message out to the public, but the media machine will come back and they will hit us as hard as they can. Now, let's look at Patrick. If we could bring Patrick up on the screen here for a bit. Patrick, you and I have had this conversations many times about how you survive. I mean, you're on a hit list. You've been demonetized by YouTube. You've been cut off by pretty much all the crowdfunding organizations. I mean, how are you getting the message out? How are you surviving down there?
Well, YouTube was the first, as you said, to demonetize me. I think in 8 years of my reporting here with over 2,000 in-depth reports in Donbass, I think I've been paid about $300 from YouTube in total. But yeah, all my work is crowdfunded. Occasionally, I've done some work in the last years with some other agencies, particularly during this year, or 2022. Did some work with India, but it was more of a point of to get the information out to that continent about what the situation really is here on the ground. But the vast majority, 99.9% of my funds come from funding from my viewers. I'm totally crowdfunded and independent. Back in the day, in 2014, 15, and 16, I was a freelancer selling video to different agencies like Associated Press, Reuters, Russia Today, Ruppli, and all across the board. But then when many of the Western channels came up with lying about my material. I can give you an example. When I was in Pervomaisk in 2015, went to a location that in the morning had taken a Grad rocket attack from Ukraine territory. I was there filming the aftermath of it because it was a soup kitchen where it was the only place people could come and get fed under shelling. And during that time, there was another attack on the soup kitchen. Everyone ran in the basement, cursing the Ukrainian military, cursing Poroshenko. There's no question who was result of this. The territory was controlled by the LNR, and Ukraine fired on this civilian soup kitchen. And I sold that material, and the Western media straight away turned around and said that it was Lugansk People's Republic forces that fired on a soup kitchen in Pervomaisk. Totally unethical and unsubstantiated, just completely bold-faced lie by the many Western agencies and channels. You can still to this day find this exact clips on YouTube saying that it was the Lugansk People's Republic forces that fired on it, and that you can see how they cut out the parts of the video. You can go to my channel and see how the civilians said that it was Ukraine. Now, this is just one of the many examples of the Western military trying to hide anything that might be negative towards Ukraine. The Western mainstream media, as you all know, will only show the things that the half-truths that are half-truths that are positive for Ukraine, and anything that might be negative for Ukraine or negative or positive for Russia, they conveniently just sweep under the rug. But that's why we're all here to try to stop them from doing that.
Let's talk about the mainstream media here. I mean, we've seen a lot of chatter on this big topic, COVID, and this is where I think Cyrus and Daniel are really going to come in here and, give us your opinions on how this transition happened, where we went from a dynamic zero COVID policy to we're open 100%. I mean, Cyrus, let's hear.
Yeah, Alex, first, I just want to kind of comment on this on censorship, because there's one thing I want people to know. I'm joining on the board with two fellow Canadians. Obviously, Daniel and yourself are both Canadian. I lived in Vancouver, Canada, the last 5 years. My entire family, my wife and 3 children, all Canadian citizens as well. The interesting thing that I want people to understand is that there is a tremendous amount of censorship going on in the West. There's a bill right now on the Canadian Parliament called Bill C11. You can Google that and do a little bit of research on that. But that essentially what the Canadian government and Justin Trudeau is trying to do right now is they're trying to pass a bill that essentially would allow the Canadian government to restrict and control any independent source of media inside of Canada, which would primarily be YouTubers. What that means is that any YouTube channel would have to then go under exactly the same rules and regulations that, for example, Canadian media, if you're looking at the CBC or, whatever Canadian media that is. So this is a huge deal that's happening in Canada, and there's been a number of Canadian YouTubers that have come out and made videos about this bill, because what it allows the government to do is that if you take a position that is something the government doesn't believe, they can essentially censor your content. That's exactly what's going to happen. And they won't censor it, that they're going to block it, but they're going to have the power to essentially move that down. You won't be able to find that on YouTube. It'll still be on YouTube, but you just won't be able to search for it. You won't be able to find it as easily. And it's a method of censorship. So I want people to understand that, because this is a big thing that's happening. And I have friends that, for example, that, in Canada right now, if you speak out anything against the COVID vaccine, you risk it being deplatformed. That's a huge thing in Canada. I know friends that have been very much outspoken. They've had their Instagram accounts suspended. They've been demonetized just for saying, look, I want to prioritize my health and I want to go exercise. I don't believe in the vaccine. Immediately suspended. And so there is that narrative. There's definitely, the West, they want to censor as much as they can. They want to control that narrative. And now answering your question about, zero COVID, it's an interesting one. And I'll kind of lead it off with this interesting one, where you see a lot of times, I mean, for what I've heard in America the last 6 months since I've relocated back to the US, everyone has been slamming China. The zero COVID, the dynamic zero COVID, it's draconian. People, many outspoken Chinese critics have said, this has nothing to do with health. This is all about Xi Jinping locking down his control. Zero COVID is going to continue for the next 5 years because, all it is about is just control. And just watch this. they're never going to pivot. Obviously, a couple of weeks after that, China pivots, they reopen. Then the whole narrative's flipped. Well, this is so irresponsible from China's government. Can't believe that they're not keeping their people safe. And I'm just like, well, shit. I mean, excuse me, my French. They can't win. It's damn if you do, damn if you don't. And that's a really, there's always, that's kind of the position I see China always in, is that no matter what they do, they're going to get slammed, from the West. And this is a classic example.
Yeah, I think with the censorship, it's quite interesting. Obviously they used different mechanisms before to try to silence people. I saw a lot of people reporting on Russia in Ukraine, kind of showing a lot of the I can't remember the exact names, but some people were sanctioned. There were British citizens who were doing reporting in Ukraine and Russia who had their bank accounts seized, or there was a German reporter also who was saying the wrong things and had I think it was her bank accounts that were seized. You get onto different lists also. All sorts of people come out of the woodwork to try to discredit you. I remember CBC, when they interviewed me, a Canadian state broadcaster, they interviewed me for about 30 minutes. I think it was about 30 minutes about the situation in China. Yeah, and the accusations in Xinjiang. And I gave them factual information. I gave them references. I gave them things they could look up. I was very careful about what I said and how I said it, because I knew that they were going to search for something to take out of context. And they just what ended up happening. Actually, what's interesting too is I told them, I said, one of the things also is you got to look at where these narratives are coming from. A lot of them are coming from U.S. State Department funded think tanks. And I said the most famous one is ASPI, Australian Strategic Policy Institute. I said the media continually uses them, uncritically pushing them, because the premise of the piece was they were looking for Chinese state sponsored influencers, and they thought I was a Chinese state sponsored influencer. So I said, the irony here is that the stories that they're confronting me with are coming from U.S. State Department funded think tanks. And when they bring ASPI on as experts for their panel or for their story, they never ever disclose that they are funded both by the U.S. State Department and the military industrial complex. So what did they do? They did their report. They brought on ASPI without mentioning all of the things that I mentioned, did exactly what I said they would do. And they took, from our 30-minute interview, they took a 3.5-second clip of me saying something that made it sound like I was agreeing to something that I wasn't agreeing to, or saying something that I wasn't agreeing to, and completely flipped it around. So they have an ombudsman that I reached out to, and they finally admitted. They said, oh, okay, we're sorry. We're going to put a correction on it. But the damage is done, right? Everybody's already seen it.
Yeah,
and
no one watches corrections.
It's going to go on their corrections page. And they said, everywhere the video lives will have this thing. That Daniel didn't actually say that. This is actually what he said. And he said, everywhere the video lives or is published, we will put that correction underneath it, a little asterisk. But they actually were still selling that clip to news aggregators, and a New Zealand media outlet posted it, and it showed up without the correction also. So they just don't care. I mean, they do these different things to kind of silence people. So this just seems like the next kind of step in this entire thing. With COVID zero, it was quite interesting too, because obviously there were protests also that happened across China. I covered that on my channel. There were different catalysts that weren't necessarily related to COVID zero, but there was a lot of built up frustration about it. I mean, it was, after a few years of living under COVID zero, especially when you get caught up in quarantines, it's pretty tolling. There was a really large understanding on the ground for it before. A lot of people were very proud for the first 1 or even 2 years, because there weren't really too many disruptions in the first couple of years. You had the occasional lockdowns in different places. But people were actually kind of proud, when they say that, they asked me, oh, have you been back to Canada? And I said, no. And they said, what's the COVID situation like there? I said, yeah, it's, there's a lot of COVID. I said, this is pretty much the safest place to be in terms of COVID. And they were very proud of that. They were very happy of that.
Correct.
But slowly it kind of wore down and people are like, what's the exit plan? There was some poor communication around in that sense. But what was interesting was when the protests happened, I even had one guy, this, pretty famous anti-China activist from Australia. He tagged me and said, this is what's going to happen. These protesters are going to get mowed down, and then Daniel's going to come out with some sort of a line to excuse it. And I said, you know what? I replied, I said, what's going to happen is when and if this crackdown, this brutal crackdown that you think is going to happen doesn't happen, because that's what you're hoping for. I mean, in Hong Kong, they were all like, this is the same thing when the Hong Kong protests were happening. They're like, they're going to send in the tanks. They're going to send in the tanks. And after a year and a half of violent riots with Molotov cocktails, police officers being stabbed, acid burned, they didn't even kill a single protester. The only death was at the hand of the protesters. But these China watchers, they were desperate for the tanks to be sent in so that their preconceptions about China would be proved. So what I said to that guy was, I said, no, what's going to happen is when and if this massive crackdown doesn't happen, and when and if they actually start relaxing their COVID policies as a response of these protests, you're not going to reflect on that. You're not going to say, hold on a second, maybe I was a little bit wrong about that, because that's exactly what happened. Shortly after the protests happened, things opened up. Now, there's a lot of mixed feelings about that, because I mean, there was this has been going on for nearly 3 years, and you would think that it wouldn't just be like, okay, we're open. It was kind of very sudden, and it was kind of, after years of getting used to doing, regular COVID tests and all this stuff, all of a sudden seeing the booths taken down, you hear about the barriers around medium risk and high risk communities being taken down, and everybody's like, "Ooh, hold on a second, this is kind of getting risky." But everybody, it was amazing how fast COVID spread here. Whatever the variant was that was here, it just ripped through everybody. There was no escaping it. And maybe that's what happened also. In addition to the protests, maybe they said, there's nothing we can do to contain this strain. It was just, I never imagined anything like this was possible. I mean, my whole family got it. It was only one intense day. And for our younger kids, there was actually no problem. But the thing is, the way that they opened up, the way that it was handled was, it was sudden. It felt like it could have been done a little bit better. Pharmacies could have been known in advance that they needed to stock up on medicines and stuff like that. So I think it could have been done better. But I kind of have the same situation that when people asked me before about my opinion on COVID zero, I said there's a lot to appreciate about it and there's a lot to hate about it. But I'm just glad I'm not in the position that I have to make these decisions, because inevitably, if they had just opened it up right from the beginning in the situation that China was in with the low number of ICU beds to population, way lower compared to a lot of other countries, there would have been a lot more people that died now. Now, there's people saying that a lot of people are dying now. I think it's a little bit overblown, the numbers. I mean, to know somebody who died, it's not unheard of, but it's not as common as you would think it is with the way that they're trying to portray this. But I don't try to debunk those, or I don't try to say, well, because of that's what was expected. I mean, finally, when China does open up, there are going to be deaths, but I don't think it's on the scale that the Western media is trying to paint it out to be. But it is interesting, like you said, Cyrus, how it all of a sudden went to, oh, how irresponsible, or how terrible China is for having these controls in place, and then how irresponsible they are for removing them. So it's a bit, I've kind of mixed feelings about it, but I agree with you generally that absolutely, no matter what China did, it would have never been good enough for Western media, and they would have always found a way to spin it in their own negative way.
Yeah, and that's what we see from the West in China, and that's why I think it's important. You have to be more objective and realistic about China. I mean, China's government released 60,000 people have died, from COVID. And the interesting thing is, you look at the numbers that, there's actually, quite a lot. I mean, I think the average age was over 80. I think 80.1, I believe, is the number of the average age of death there. So it's certainly affecting, as you would imagine, the elderly, most of whom who do have underlying health conditions. I mean, we saw that data very similar coming out of Hong Kong. When Hong Kong opened up, they had a huge surge of deaths. There's, I think, around 60,000 people died, but it was amazing statistic. It was something like 95% were over the age of 75, and all of those people had underlying health conditions. So I think that's where also as we know, I mean, China's economy has been, hammered by these policies. And, it's at a point where it's like, hey, we're 3 years into this. The only, group that's really at a big risk right now is going to be the elderly. So we're going to launch a campaign that's going to try to get them vaccinated. Even CNN, in a rare moment of truth, had said, look, actually China's vaccine, if you get 3 doses, is exactly the same level of efficacy as 2 doses of the Moderna. So there's a big thing, saying like, oh, China doesn't have mRNA, they have inferior technology. Meanwhile, we see that even CNN had said, look, if you have 3 doses, it's exactly the same level. So the Chinese vaccines work. And again, it's more that elderly population. My whole family got COVID as well. Daniel and I, we both have young children, but I mean, it was the young children. I mean, basically zero. I mean, they had nothing. They were completely fine. So I think it's good, for China to open. And I think it was actually very positive. I made a video talking about the protests in China and saying this is actually a good thing because, number one, it shows you that protests do exist in China. We have this illusion in the West that, if you ever speak out, immediately tanks are going to be coming down the streets and you're going to go to jail, you're going to be executed. We have these very, very wild imagination here in the West about what's actually happening in China, where actually protests are very common in China. Happens all the time. We've seen numbers of protests, happen all over China in 2022. We'll continue to see that. Chinese people do continue to speak out, whether it's on social media or other mechanisms. So again, it's just always kind of looking at it from just trying to be a little bit more realistic about, about what's going to happen. But I think, it was interesting. I made a number of videos from a consumer electronics show. I've been showing that was on the ground here in Las Vegas last week. There was a lot of energy from a lot of people that I met. There was over 112,000 people in attendance. A lot of Chinese companies there. Over 150 companies came in from mainland China. A lot of Chinese people on the ground. And a lot of people were happy because it was the first time in 3 years that this consumer electronics show met. And as you can imagine, I mean, it's a tech show. So, I mean, China has a big presence here. So I think I'm very optimistic for the future. I think 2023 is going to be a good year of reopening. Obviously, the border's now open. And I think, we can move forward and China is going to continue to play its role in our world economy.
Cyrus, I wanted to ask you, I mean, we're seeing our local economy here rebound. I think in our last year, we only had a 2% GDP growth, and that was last year. Right. And we're expecting it to recover to 6% here locally here in Chongqing. We're also, I don't know if you're aware of this, Daniel, but there are organized tours of, companies getting on flights, going to Europe, going to the United States, going out and, really trying to promote their product. We're really seeing that here. I've noticed even here in the local economy. I mean, I think it was 2 nights ago, I was in the city center.
Yep.
I couldn't walk. It was like just jammed, and I haven't seen that in a year and a half of being here. So the recovery is there. I mean, Cyrus, you were at the Consumer Electronics Show. Are you feeling that push? What did you sense from the Chinese there?
Well, I think what's interesting is my last video I made, I kind of highlighted some of these companies, and a lot of them were. I've even spoke to some American executives who said, look, we need this relationship with China, right? Our company would not be possible. It wouldn't be profitable if it wasn't for China. And I think there's a huge disconnect, right? Our politicians here in the West are preaching to us that we need to decouple from China. We don't need China. Let's just, do everything internally. But that's not how the world makes progress, right? We live in a global economy where, I mean, and we've seen this going back to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. I mean, when you sanction Russia, I mean, no one could have thought, how the implications on the global economy and how that has really backfired amongst certainly European countries, but even here in the United States. And that's where, we miscalculated with the sanctions, and sanctions never really work. I mean, there's not a lot of proof of really a successful track record with sanctions to begin with. But it just shows you, and that's kind of what I mentioned, with, okay, well, look at, for example, Germany. I mean, how reliant they are on that Russian gas. I mean, I spoke to some German nationals on the show, and they had said, it's kind of, Germany is still very pro-Ukraine, and they're going to keep fighting this. But one of the German nationals that told me, he said, it's interesting because we're spending so much more on heating and electricity and this cost of energy right now, but it's okay because we kind of have a lot of reserves. We have a lot of people are using their savings right now, and it's almost like we're doing this for the noble cause. But I think what's going to happen is in the summer when people realize, oh, wow, I don't have any money to go on holiday now because I've been spending it all on my energy to stay warm this winter, that sentiment's going to change a little bit. So again, I mean, I'm one that is always preaching that we live in a global economy, that we need to find ways to work together. So I think there's, again, I saw a lot of energy from that show and a lot of willingness to be working with China. And I think the opening up is a great thing.
Yeah, I think a lot of countries are going to have to really pay attention to how they handle this influx of Chinese passengers also, because I mean, I think, have you seen the videos of Thailand welcoming?
Oh yeah, that's awesome.
I mean, yeah. Let me get you to the numbers with this here, okay? So I was chatting with my wife the other day. We lived in Thailand for about 5 or 6 years. The Chinese were responsible for 25% of tourists that went to Thailand. 11 million. And Cyrus, you and I think, looked at the charts the other day on this.
Yeah.
11 million in 2019. 2020, they had about 1.5 million, but that was taking into consideration January, February numbers. And then, of course, the lockdowns happened. 2020, it was 13,000 people. And now they're expecting maybe 1 million. And they're getting excited about that. That is 10% of what they normally got. So I think it's more of a wait and see here. I think people are still kind of nervous to travel. Nervous to even, when you go to the train station, you're expecting to be a COVID test or to show your codes. Yeah. And I'm still always reaching for my phone when I'm trying to get into the shopping mall. Or in fact, when I'm going to the shopping mall, I'm thinking, is it open? Because shouldn't there be somebody out there with a temperature thing and a big QR code to scan? So there's that. It's really kind of locked into, these COVID protocols that they've had here in China. But I want to pose this question to the entire panel here. I mean, China is really going to be pushing the button here to try to get this economy going. Is this going to be impacted by what's going on in Russia? And I think, I'd like to hear everybody's opinion with that. Is that going to be derailed by this ongoing conflict in Russia? Or, I mean,
I can't think of the connection personally, but I just want to actually follow up on the tourists going abroad, going to Thailand and being welcome, politicians coming out. I think this is going to be, well, they just came out with an article also that I think it's I can't remember which airport in Australia, they're going to have to hire 2,000 new people to cope with the influx of Chinese travelers that are going to be coming in. I mean, this is going to be a massive job creating opportunity also.
Massive reboot.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to do a lot of good things for the global economy. South Korea, I don't know what's going to happen with them, because when the Chinese passengers showed up in South Korean airports, they had to wear yellow tags around their necks. And then finally they came out with the numbers. They came out with the numbers of how many Chinese passengers tested positive for COVID versus from other places, and it was equal to or lower from people coming from other places.
I'm going to add to this. You want to know where the Chinese are going to be traveling? They're going to Russia, because this brand new EV. Alex, maybe you can comment. You've talked about this on your program a few times about this new visa that the Russian government come up with, the e-visa.
Yeah, the e-visa. They've actually had it for about a year and a half, but they're extending it. And it first started out as an e-visa, which would grant you access to St. Petersburg and Kaliningrad, to those areas. You could travel there by plane, but you could only stay for 8 days. That includes your arrival and your departure. So about 6 full days, let's say, in those areas. And it was just a visa where you would apply online and you would get approved within a matter of a couple of days. And that was it. No trips to the embassy, none of that stuff. And now they've extended it to cover, I think, just about every major city, every major region in Russia, if I'm not mistaken, if not all of Russia, is going to be covered by that. And I think by June 2023, the foreign ministry said that they should have that visa covering all of Russia for, I believe, that they were hinting at maybe 30 days. I believe now they've extended it to 14 days, the e-visa, and I think they're going to make it by June to cover 1 month. So it's going to be a very simple visa. Yeah.
I had a friend just send this to me a while back, and it's a screenshot of showing Moscow and promoting going to Russia, and that is in a Chinese travel brochure. So why wouldn't they go there? I mean, if you think about it, I mean, the airlines are still functioning. There's no grounded airlines like the Russian airlines can still fly to China, no problem.
Well, don't forget that the airlines coming from Asia, coming from the east to west, can use Russia. The European airlines cannot fly over Russia. Remember, this is the EU did this. The EU did this. Russia did not do this. The EU did this, and Russia reciprocated. So that's going to that's going to affect a lot of the European airlines. They're not going to be able to cross over Russia to fulfill trips and destinations to Asia. They're going to have to figure out ways to go around, if that's even possible. While the Asian airlines, they can travel through Russia, through Russian airspace.
I mean, Patrick, your thoughts? I mean, you have any thoughts on China? I know you and I have had a discussion, a few of them, about it, but your thoughts?
Well, I think as far as China and even China and Taiwan goes, I think I'm going to have to more or less reserve my opinions till I'm able to get there on the ground and to check it out. And I'm actually very interested to arrive and just kind of talk to the locals on both sides if possible. But as we know, it's not always possible to do that on both sides of every conflict. So we'll have to see how it goes. But I'm definitely interested in getting a lot more on the ground information on the situation, so I can more form my own opinions on it, better informed.
I think it's quite interesting that the way you answered that. I mean, you and Cyrus had an amazing live stream. I believe it was probably 6 to 8 months ago. One of the most popular videos on Cyrus's channel. And I remember calling Cyrus saying, Cyrus, you got to listen to this guy. He's on the ground. And Cyrus is like, yeah, sure, man. Yeah, let's go. Let's get him on the show. And you guys chatted about it. And it was interesting because your experience that you shared there in the Donbass and what you told Cyrus, I mean, it was like 2 weeks later, Cyrus was, I'm not saying completely 180, but he was open to hearing it and to understanding it, and the audience was wanting to really, that's why it's one of the most popular videos. But once again, I think there should be almost a reboot on this live stream between you two again, to maybe have that discussion about Taiwan, because Cyrus, you've really covered this subject a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I appreciate Patrick coming on my show, and it was one where I'm always trying to stay curious, right? And I think that's what I just want people to do, is always question the media, always just do your own research. And when Alex, you introduced Patrick as, hey, there's an American that's been on the ground since 2014 in Ukraine. I mean, he absolutely has a voice that needs to be heard. So I think when we're listening to guys like John Mearsheimer, Patrick, guys that have a lot of knowledge, Alex as well, the Duran, you guys do a fantastic job. So, I mean, I think it's just about, educating yourself. And I think that's what I try to promote. And again, it's the same reason why, when we go back to China, as you, Alex, and Daniel on the ground there in Chongqing, I mean, what China is really like, compared to what is being presented in our Western media. There was an interesting clip. Alex, I don't know if you saw. Did you see this thing that blew up yesterday with Jackson Wang?
Yes,
the singer. He was giving a concert in London, and he basically had said, there's a lot of propaganda. He's like, I'm proud, I'm from China. And he's like, if you guys ever go there, you'll realize it's a pretty dope country. And so that went viral, and everyone was talking about that. So again, it's just it's very different, right? I mean, I brought so many friends from the United States to China, when I was living in Shanghai, and it's always that perception of what you think China's like, and then wow, I get to the ground and it's very different than what's being presented in our media. And I will say that I've actually been very happy to come back to the United States, because I feel there's a lot of work that I can do on the ground here. And I've got to be honest, in 6 months being back, I mean, I've talked to so many people. I show everybody my YouTube channel. I talk to people very openly about China, and I've always had very positive interactions. People are genuinely very curious, because the reality is most Americans know absolutely nothing. You know, they're just like, oh, I thought China's an evil place, you know, and then I'm like, no, let me just kind of give you a little bit more perspective. And so, you know, that's a positive thing that, you know, that I'm seeing right now.
Yeah, they use it's the psychology of social proof to make it seem like most people think this in order to kind of guide people towards thinking, oh, well, if most people think this, I should think this too. But actually, they're not really set in their opinions. I think it was either NATO's official Twitter account or it was somebody. They released a video also saying that the world stands with Ukraine, and they had these images of protesters all around the world from every single country saying we stand with Ukraine with these Ukrainian flags. And some people were kind of laughing at it because the image for Sri Lanka, where the Sri Lankan protesters said Colombo, there wasn't a single brown protester in sight. They were all foreigners, right. And but it's a very powerful tool, the psychological tool of social proof, where you say, well, everybody else thinks this, so you know you should go along with it. So probably the people you're interacting with are like that. They're just like, oh, I just thought everybody thought China was evil, and that's it. But they're not as invested in it as people make it seem like in the media. I want to go back to, you know, with Patrick. I really appreciate what he says also. You know, before he forms an opinion, he wants to go on the ground. He wants to investigate it himself. I think that's the thing to do. And that's why I'm really careful about forming opinions on other topics, because I saw that when Hong Kong is a place that I knew personally. My kids were born there. I lived there. My kid went to school there. I sat down with protesters also. I knew people who joined the protesters, and I just listened to both sides. And then I formed my opinion. And then, so with Russia and Ukraine, I can see a lot of parallel. There are some things you can do from afar. You can say, well, hold on a second. I've seen this act before. I've seen this before. I've seen these kinds of omissions of details before. I've seen these kinds of people absolutely unwilling to acknowledge basic facts. So there probably are some things you can see from afar and say, oh, there's a lot of parallels here. It does look like something's being provoked here or things like that. But ultimately, at the end of the day, having a cautious approach, like Patrick saying, you know what, you really got to get on the ground, or you really got to get in deep, I think is the right way to go. Or, listen to people who have been there too. And I think that's a great thing that you're doing, is actually talking to people on the ground. And I think I agree with you. That's a great place to be, to actually talk to people and say, hey guys, no, actually you kind of got it wrong. At the end of the day, it could even be that's the kind of conversation and the kind of discourse that could prevent wars also. I mean, I know that sounds pretty grandiose, but that's exactly what's happening. What we were talking about earlier, when you see an enemy continually being demonized like this, or somebody who's a supposed enemy, what comes next. I can't remember what the phrase was. It was, there was a phrase, something along the lines of, before you engage your enemy, you must first demonize them. Otherwise, how are you going to sleep with yourself at night? Right. You have to tell them that they're these terrible people that are doing terrible things, and something needs to be done about it. And no matter how many times afterwards, whether it's with Iraq or Libya or whatever, you say, oops, it turns out we were wrong. It's amazing how many times those same things and those same playbooks can be recycled over and over and over again with very, very minimal change required. And so something needs to be done with people having these conversations with people saying, guys, no, actually, you know what, you're being led down the wrong path here, or, consider the other side of the story.
Well, Patrick, I know you're a family man, and your whole family and wife is from Donetsk, and children. I just wanted to say thank you. I know that you have the children coming home soon, so I just wanted to tell you, all of us here on the show, your reporting is absolutely tremendous. We understand on a daily basis that you risk your life. And really, my heart goes out to you. And there's not a day that goes by that we appreciate everything that you do. And maybe you'd like to say goodbye to the audience before you head out?
Unfortunately, got to kind of head out now. As you said, my family's coming home now. And tonight will actually be our last night together for quite a while. Tomorrow, I'm headed back to the front, and it's going to be making a big trip across, hopefully, all the fronts. Going to decide exactly which area to start in tomorrow, whether it's going to be the Soledar area, or possibly thinking about going up north to Kharkov, as I had said, the LNR-Kharkov border, and then hopefully work our way all the way down to the Kherson area, just showing all the information that's not being shown by the Western mainstream media, or as much of it as we can. So yeah, that's just the way it is. And I wish all you guys the best. And thanks a lot for having me on, guys. And hope to see you, Alex, soon. It'll be great. And all the best to everyone.
Good
Take
to
care,
see
Pat.
you.
Thanks for your work.
Stay safe, Patrick.
Right. Thanks for your work too, guys.
Thank you. Cheers. Gentlemen, so let's do the last segment of the show here, and we'll wrap up things. I'm going to hand the microphone over to Dan. Well, actually, Cyrus first, and then we'll pivot to Daniel, then back to Alex, and then I'll wrap it up. So, Cyrus, China.
All right. Well, I kind of made this point already, but I'll just mention it again. I mean, I think this is 2023 is going to be a very pivotal year for China. I'm very encouraged by the government that they've moved away from, zero COVID, that they have indeed started opening up again. I think that we're going to see, this is important for China. I mean, it's important for the economy that they made this move, but I think it's also important for our relations with China, because I'm one for more dialogue. It's very difficult, for example, when the United States president is not on the ground in China, right? Like, our president should be going to Beijing. They should be sitting down, having dialogue. And that's something that a lot of leaders were not able to do because of the zero COVID policy. Now that things are opening up again, I'm very optimistic that that's going to improve relations, because we're going to have more dialogue and more communication. But I think what I've learned, one thing here, being in the United States and going to trade shows and talking with a lot of people on the ground, there's a really interesting thing is when you talk to actual businessmen, and so many of them really understand this global economy. They understand how connected we are to China, and that's why I tend to focus a little bit more on the business side. And we're never going to see eye to eye, whether it's our government policies or our beliefs in the type of government, things like that. There's always going to be differences between the U.S. and China, but we have been building an economic relationship for well over 50 years, and I think it's important we continue to do that. And again, I'm optimistic for 2023 that we can improve that.
Well, thanks for that, and we'll go to Daniel.
Yeah, I mean, the same kinds of things. I'm pretty optimistic about what's in store for China also. COVID zero was quite a journey. There's probably some people that have a little bit of PTSD from it, because it was, it was a long time going. And to be honest, to be a little bit more kind of balanced, I think there was a lot of goodwill that was built up in China after the Hong Kong situation. When the Hong Kong situation happened, a lot of people in China all of a sudden started seeing, and even in Hong Kong also, started seeing their government quite a bit different. People who weren't necessarily very pro-China or anti-China all of a sudden became very positive about China. With mainland, it was because, one of the things, I guess it's like with the Russia conflict, there was a catalyst for people in Europe and in the West where it's hurting their pocketbook. So all of a sudden they're like, well, let me look at this a little bit more critically. And people in China, mainlanders, were targeted during the 2019 protests. And it was amazing to see how people could be radicalized to turn on their own people. All of a sudden with, the first district elections after, like district council elections after the protests, it was really kind of split down the middle in terms of how many people voted for pro-democracy parties and pro-establishment parties. That's kind of a flexible word, won the majority of the seats, but when you looked at the number of votes, it was kind of split down the middle, and it kind of made people think a little bit more about what true democracy is. I think it was Ben Franklin who even said, there has to be a better system of democracy than two wolves and a lamb deciding what's for dinner. Right. And that kind of really emphasized it in Hong Kong, where it wasn't the protesters who were silenced. It was the people who were against the protesters. They were afraid to speak up. Right. They were being attacked. Their businesses were being burnt down. I remember when a Hong Kong artist came over to Shenzhen, I picked them up from the Shenzhen Bay Bridge to take them to their pop-up gallery. And they said, as soon as they crossed the border, they're like, finally, I'm free to say whatever I want. This is them coming from Hong Kong into the mainland. Wow. And so there was this buildup of where people all of a sudden started to see And then finally, sorry, the last piece of context also was seeing how the Western media completely misrepresented what was going on in Hong Kong and how they ignored certain things. There was a lot of goodwill that was built up with the people. COVID zero has a little bit more of a mixed opinions, especially with how long it took and how sudden the opening was. So I think, you know, there was a study by the Harvard Ash Institute before that showed that the Chinese government enjoys 90+% support from their people. This was before COVID. I don't know what it is now. It probably went down a little bit, but I would imagine it's still higher than most Western government support. And you really got the sense of that. And Cyrus, I'm sure when you were in China also, that a lot of people were really, really positive about their government. I think that's going to be built back up really quickly, even for the people who are like, oh, I think this COVID zero thing could have been handled better. And I feel pretty optimistic for what's coming for this new year.
Alex from the Duran.
Well, China opening up is good news for China. Good news for Russia. Very, very bad news for the European Union. Very, very bad news. Because as China opens up, it is going to suck up all of the commodities, the energy, the gas, the oil that right now the European Union is outbidding all the countries around the world to store up on. And so China re-entering the world economy is going to really hurt the European Union in a very, very big way. And the European Union is going to have a choice. Do they continue down this path of sanctioning Russia, or do they finally pull back? And so I think the more China opens up, the worse it gets for Europe, the higher the costs will be for European businesses, to the point where this deindustrialization that we're seeing is going to really ramp up. They're going to be priced out of the markets, out of all the markets. China's going to suck up all the gas, all the oil, all the commodities, and things are going to turn really, really bad for the EU if they don't change course.
Thank you for that. And Patrick, Patrick has left the program, and I just want to say thank you again to him and his viewers that are still with us. Alex, maybe you can explain to our viewers where they can find you, how they can find you, what platforms that you're on.
Yeah, you can find us on the Duran. You can find us on my channel, Alex Christoforou, as well as Alexander's channel, Alexander Mercouris. We are on YouTube. We are on Rumble, BitChute, Odyssey, Telegram, Rockfin, and the Duran.locals.com. That is where you can always find us, is on the Duran.locals.com.
I really appreciate you taking the time out of your Sunday for us. And thanks again. For all you that haven't seen Alex's channel, it's actually one that I actually wait for to get my news every day. It's I put the headphones in and listen to it. I mean, it's fantastic coverage that you do. Really appreciate and commend you for your hard work. And as well, Cyrus Janssen, thank you. And Cyrus, where can our viewers find you?
Yeah, best resources right here on YouTube. Also pretty active on Twitter as well. And if you want to, and also LinkedIn. So they'll just type in my name, Cyrus Janssen.
Okay. And Daniel Dumbrill.
Yeah, I'm on Twitter, a little bit more active on Twitter than I'm on YouTube, but just under my name, Daniel Dumbrill. I haven't been making many videos recently. You know, my thing was the Hong Kong protest. That's what I knew. And then I got to a point where I kind of felt like, you know, there were people who just didn't, they were going to believe what they wanted to believe. And I kind of lost hope a little bit in the fact that conversations could still move people. But after listening to Alex and Cyrus, I think these conversations are still really important. So who knows, I'll start uploading maybe more on YouTube and maybe doing some more stuff with you. So I'm on YouTube under my name, Daniel Dumbrill.
And I just want to again thank the audience. We hit the 5,000 mark for the show, and all the channels are below in the description boxes. Whatever channel that you're watching from, all the links are there. So don't forget to subscribe to everybody's channel. Gentlemen, once again, thank you very much. We won't leave the audience high and dry. We'll just play a bit of outro music so everybody can say their goodbyes. And once again, really appreciate it. I was a little bit nervous tonight.
You did okay.
I was a bit nervous.
It was kind of, you know, this was a little bit experimental, wasn't it? It was, but I think,
yeah. It was, and, you know, trying to talk to everybody in time zones. Patrick answers maybe once in every 48 hours, says, yeah, I'm in. Alex, I know you got a tremendously busy schedule. Sorry about that. But, and then Cyrus is on a complete time zone. I think you woke up at 5 a.m., Cyrus. So,
actually 4, but yeah, that's all good.
Anyway, that's it from us here on a Sunday. And just want to say once again, thanks very much. And we'll talk to you guys soon. Take care.
Take care. Good to see you guys.
Take care, guys.